Inflation, it seems to be the politicians' favorite economic threat during campaign season. But what is inflation? How does it impact our lives? And how should we be responding to it? Jerry Bowyer, financial economist and the head of Bowyer Research, joins us to break down those questions and more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. Inflation, we always hear about it, especially during campaign season, and yet it leaves so many of us in confusion. What is inflation? What does it do to the economy? More importantly, what's it mean for your family and mine? And how should we respond to it? Our guest tonight is Jerry Bowyer of Bowyer Research. He is a financial economist, an author, a columnist, a radio and television host, a real jack of all trades, but an expert on this topic. And we're pleased to welcome him tonight. Jerry, welcome to Face the Issues, and thank you for being with us.
Sam, pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you. Jerry, let's just jump into this conversation right away. When we talk about inflation, again, this is something we hear all the time. I mean, you can't go through a campaign season and not hear about politicians saying there's a threat of inflation or we're in a period of inflation. What is inflation when we're talking about the economy?
Well, and when politicians talk about it, it's usually the politicians who are challenging, not the incumbent, right? So incumbents will tend to play down the threat of inflation or the existence of inflation, and challengers tend to play it up. It was extremely important in the election of 1980, where there was this idea of a misery index, which is a combination of unemployment and inflation. You glom them together. I'm not sure that it makes a lot of economic sense to put those together in one number, but it sure made political sense as kind of a measurement of two different. If you don't have a job, that's one form of misery. And if you have a job, but your paycheck isn't buying enough, that's another form of misery. And I think that helped get Reagan elected. And that was during a period of what's called stagflation, which is low economic growth, which goes together with high unemployment. Growing businesses hire people, shrinking businesses lay people off, and growing prices at the same time. So if we end up going into a period of stagflation again, then that becomes grist for the mill for whoever challenges Joe Biden, or if he retires early, whoever challenges Vice President Harris. They might have inflation and stagnation to talk about as a topic in a political challenge.
All right. So when we think about inflation, generally speaking, I mean, we hear people say something like the dollar is strong or the dollar is weak. What do they mean by that?
Well, when people say that, when they use a phrase like that, they're usually talking in the context of our relationship with other currencies. So the dollar is strong means it takes fewer dollars to buy a euro, or fewer dollars to buy yen. Of course, you don't buy a yen with dollars, you buy a yen with dimes. So it all depends on how strong that other currency is. And some people make a pretty hard distinction between those two things. But when you're thinking about a weak currency, that's just another way of saying inflation. Takes more dollars to buy a yen, takes more dollars to buy a euro, takes more dollars to buy a Snickers bar, takes more dollars to buy a car. These are all ways of saying that the dollar is losing its value, which to me morally is a way of saying that there's some kind of unjust weights and measures thing going on here. There's an injustice. There's a taking of the labor of somebody if the government does something to the currency which decreases its value. You may not, I mean, it's no different than a tax. It's no different than enforced labor in some sense. It's just more subtle, but morally, it's taking at least some of the output of someone's productive work and appropriating it to the government or to the friends of the government. Like, for instance, those who get the new money printed earlier in the process, like people who work in money center banks.
Let me ask about that. I mean, because when we talk about inflation, prices are going up, or the worth of money is decreasing. And right. So $5, 20 years ago and $5 today numerically look the same, but their worth is different. There's a difference in their worth. So what causes inflation? I mean, on some points we hear that prices going up is causing inflation, or the printing of more money is causing inflation. But what's causing inflation, and what is inflation causing? Because I think there's a difference there.
Yeah, I think the printing more money is closer to the mark. I think it's the printing of money relative to the production of goods and services. There was this famous story where a great economist, one of the great economists of the 20th century, a man named Ludwig von Mises, was approached by people associated with the government. This is in Austria in the interwar period, and inflation was running wild. And he said, why are we having so much inflation? What should we do about it? And he didn't answer. I said, ask me later. And he did this a few times. And finally, he said to these bankers and central bank officials, he said, I want you to meet me tonight at midnight at this particular address. And just tell us. No, I'm not going to tell you. Just meet me at midnight at this particular address. And the address was the corner where the central bank and the mint were located. And he said, do you hear that noise? There was this and they said, yes. He said, what is that? And he said, well, that's the printing presses. That's the printing presses for our currency. And he said, when you don't hear that, when that sound stops, the inflation will stop. So inflation tends to be the creation of money in excess of the creation of goods and services. That's, like I said, a form of unjust weights and measures, and it's destructive, and it's most destructive of the people who are least able to handle it. Sure. That is, people who spend most of their income to live, not people who can live on like a third of their income and then invest the rest. It's people who don't have excess income who are less able to, who are most harmed by it.
Sure. And so then what's the effect of it? Because when we look at inflation, obviously prices go up. But there's the other side where they say, well, oftentimes inflation also leads to greater employment. Now, is that a bit of a catch-22 that you're employed, but the cost, the worth of your income is now decreasing? Is that like a catch-22 there, or what's the impact of inflation?
Well, it would be a catch-22 if it were true, but it's not true. So we don't have that trade-off. That idea in economics is called the Phillips Curve. We don't need to get too technical. It comes from Keynesian economics. Now, John Maynard Keynes created a revolution in the 20th century in economics. And Keynes' idea was that savings is a bad thing, that spending is a good thing, and that we needed to inflate the money supply to kind of manipulate people into spending. Now, this wasn't based on real analysis. For Keynes was brought up by Victorians. He was an Edwardian, and he rebelled against the Christianity, against the moral code of the Victorian era. He embraced an idea of, he had a very negative view towards women. He had a very negative view towards the traditional moral code. He practiced his negative view very vociferously with his friends. And I really think that infected his economics, because he was he was engaging in practices that would never lead to the creation of children. And so he didn't think about the long-term consequences of his action. He wanted to live for today. Now, I think that was because of a worldview, a spiritual issue. But it got hard-coded into economic policy to the point where we thought what we need to do is print the money to cause the inflation, to punish people for savings, to get them to spend, to goose things. That's not my understanding. My understanding is that human beings were created to be creative. And so we're being what we're supposed to be when we're working and producing goods and services. The goal is productivity, not stimulating demand. Everyone is born with infinite demand. This is the difference between Keynesian and supply-side economics. The trick is getting people to actually supply the demands of others, to serve others in a marketplace. So this trade-off between inflation and unemployment, it doesn't make theoretical sense, makes cultural sense for Keynes. And it doesn't fit the data. The world just doesn't work that way. And that's what stagflation taught us in the 70s. We had high unemployment and high inflation, something that the academic establishment said was impossible.
Is there a concern that we as a society are somewhat impressed or pushing towards that view of economics, though? And when you think about right now, the debate over stimulus payments. Now, we can argue the merit of people needing paychecks because they were put out of jobs because of the pandemic. That's a whole different conversation, I think. But just economically speaking, I mean, this is not the first time we've done the stimulus payment. This is probably the third, fourth time we've done it in the last 10 years. The idea that we need to give individuals more money that they can put back into the economy. To your point, Jerry, doesn't that contribute toward inflation?
Well, I tell you what it doesn't do is it doesn't stimulate the economy. It's the third or fourth time we tried it, but it's the third or fourth time it's failed because it's based on that same idea. The idea is that the trick is to get people to spend. People love to spend. The trick is to reward people for working and being productive enough that they have enough income that they can go out and spend it. And just taking a couple of $1 trillion from us in the form of taxes or debasing the currency, and then giving that couple of $1 trillion back to us doesn't put money into the economy. I mean, if you just think about it, it's completely illogical. There's this big bathtub of money, and we take a bucket out, and then we pour the bucket back in, and we say, look, you've been stimulated. That's not what stimulation, I don't think stimulation is even a goal. Long-run productivity is the goal. And what happens is the economy is just like life. I mean, you want to give somebody a stimulant. You want to hit them with epinephrine or cocaine or something like that. You can get them to pop up, for a little while. And then what happens after that? Nothing good. So the point is to have a healthy, strong, growing economy, and stimulus does not help. And especially doesn't help in this case, because here's what we're doing. We take money from people, and then we give it back to them. And then we say, spend it in the restaurants and movie theaters and sporting events that you're not actually legally allowed to attend. I mean, we're both in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
This has pretty much been a shutdown state.
Yes.
So how does it stimulate demand if we put money into people's pockets that they're not allowed to spend? What happens? They just hoard the dollars. So all we've done is increase. We took money out of the bank account, then we put money back into the bank account, and we borrowed it from my grandchild. I mean, we're borrowing this from Arthur. Arthur's going to pay this back, not me. And we haven't stimulated the economy at all.
Yeah. Jerry, that's a good word. When we come back, we're going to go to the break. When we come back, I want to talk about how we respond to inflation and specifically fears of inflation. So don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Jerry Bowyer is our guest. Jerry, thank you again for joining us. I want to continue this conversation on inflation. Obviously, inflation is something that occurs in our economics, but we all feel it. And I think more than inflation, we often feel the fear of inflation or the threat of inflation. We hear on the news so much. I don't think a lot of us fully understand what it is that we're talking about, but we fear it, or we're told to fear it. How, in your experience, how have you seen people react to inflation or to fears of inflation?
Well, let's start with fears of inflation. I happen to dwell in a certain tribe, right? And my tribe would be conservative, largely evangelical people. And we have had so many inflation scares in the past, really, 15, 20 years, scares about the dollar is going to collapse. A lot of this in talk radio. Glenn Beck basically kind of built a career on this. In some ways, various people have written books about the coming crash. And it didn't happen, right? And I think what I've said to a lot of those people, some of them are friends of mine and people I know, hey, this is a threat, but you're really early. And I think what that's done is that's created a sense now that we're a little jaded. The boy who cried wolf doesn't get listened to. So because conservatives have talked about inflation dangers, and we didn't get much of it, we haven't really had a lot of inflation since the 70s. We had kind of a spurt in the mid-aughts and like short spurt in 2009. But generally, we've been in a low inflation environment since the 1980s. There's kind of a sense of, I guess inflation doesn't happen anymore. And I think it's actually rising as a risk now. So I think people need to be concerned about that. So we can't let false positives. We can't let the problem of the boy who cried wolf. In that story, in the original version of the story, it's not a story about the boy. It's a story about the village, right? In the newer version of the story, the boy gets eaten by the wolf. But in the old version, in Aesop, the village gets attacked because they didn't listen to the boy.
Right.
So just because there have been false predictions of inflation in the past doesn't mean that we can be sanguine about it. And we should be more concerned about inflation the more our leaders aren't. So in the past couple of weeks, the central bank and political leaders have said over and over again, inflation is not a concern. They're the guardians of the value of our currency. When they say inflation is not a concern, that means they're not guarding the value of the currency. And when the guards aren't guarding, that's when we should be a little more on guard.
Well, that makes sense. Now, one of the things is sometimes the reaction to this, it almost seems like overdrive. And so you see this with calls for the gold standard. You see this with shifts towards cryptocurrency, the rise of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. Is this something that you see? And how do you explain why there's this drive toward things like gold or Bitcoin?
Well, I think the drive towards gold, there was a strong drive towards gold when Obama went on a spending spree. And then there was another drive towards gold when President Trump went on a spending spree. Gold doesn't care what your party registration is. I mean, gold was $20 an ounce when Nixon took us off the gold standard. So it didn't say, he's an R, it's okay. It's what we do that markets react to. So I think that, the fact that gold has been around, went up to almost $2,000 an ounce, that's expressing fear. Now, what we're seeing is that cyber currencies, cryptocurrencies, are beginning to play the role or adding to their voice that gold used to. So gold has gone down to some degree as cryptos have gone up. It's almost like some investors are saying, okay, we're going to take some of our fear money, some of our in case of emergency break glass money out of gold and put it into cryptos. What's interesting about that is that people generally don't understand cryptocurrencies. They're kind of complicated. They're kind of weird and abstract. A lot of people who are buying them don't understand them. So what does that mean? Well, it means people must be really concerned if they're buying something they don't understand, because they kind of do understand the dollar and they kind of do understand gold. And now they're going to cryptos, even though they don't quite get it. And it's almost like they're in an auditorium and they think they smell smoke and they see an exit door and people are crowding around that exit door and they don't know exactly where that door goes to. But if a lot of people, they'll go through the mystery door, they'll put a few $1,000s into crypto. That's an indication of how worried they are about the main auditorium of dollar and yen and euro and yuan and all of the paper currencies of the world.
Do you advise that?
No.
And why not? What's the risk with something like cryptocurrency?
I don't advise that because I don't advise. I'm not a financial advisor.
Fair enough.
So I don't advise it and I don't non-advise it. It would be my job to explain to people kind of what the dynamics are. So I'm more in the role of saying, what is this market telling you about this particular asset class? I would also say that this is an asset class that's, pretty complex and pretty confusing. So, I mean, to the degree that I would advise, I would say, this is not your retirement money. This is not your, you need it for college for your kids' money. When I do talk to people who are investors, frequently advisors bring me in. What I learned is that investors come to them with ideas all the time, and they say, "Okay, we're going to create a little crazy account for you. Here's like 2 or 3% of your money. Go ahead. You heard something at church, or you read something in the internet, and you're convinced. Go ahead. It's only 2%. We're just going to count that as a loss, and you can go ahead and do something with it." So I think that if you're there, then that's fine. What I think is that a lot of people who are behind and not ready to retire look for the moonshot. So they try to get in on the GameStop momentum or something that they see on TV or hear a lot, or buy cryptocurrencies to make up for lost time. And that's not really smart. I mean, it might work. Crazy things work sometimes, but a crazy thing is something that that has a very low probability of working. You can buy a lottery ticket and it might work. It's a crazy way to build your retirement. I wouldn't recommend it. But for some people, it works. And, some of these investments are kind of in that zone of you don't understand it. It's a flyer and it worked for somebody. But what generally happens is it works for early adopters. And then the people who come in at the end, most of the dollars come in at the top of the bubble and they tend to get crushed. So one thing I would say is don't read, Bitcoin went up to 55,000. I should get in. That's
you're too late at that point, aren't you?
At that point, you're less likely. I mean, the more it's gone up, the less there's a certain amount of gains that ultimately that's going to get. So if if it's gone from 5,000 to 50,000 and you were thinking about it, well, then those are gains that already happened. So the more expensive it gets, the riskier it is.
So quickly here, what would you say to somebody who was worried about inflation?
I would say you need to talk to your financial advisor about it. And advisors can look at various ways to hedge that risk.
Sure.
You can buy, there are funds that actually track future CPI. You can buy inflation. You can, there are instruments that allow you to have your portfolio go up when inflation goes up. You can modify, say, things that, do badly in inflation, like regular treasury bonds. There are things that are inflation protected, something called TIPS. Again, this is all advisory. Everyone's picture is different. You can look at adding gold or even silver to your portfolio. So there are traditional inflation hedges. You can look at foreign currencies. Like, for instance, there are ETFs and mutual funds that are invested globally. So if the dollar's weakening, other currencies might get stronger. Say emerging market currencies tend to get stronger when the dollar weakens, even more than developed market. I was just doing that research recently. So what you do is you diversify. There's a principle here. It's a biblical principle in Ecclesiastes. You divide into portions of 7. So you don't take a crazy flyer on an inflation hedge, but you treat it like insurance. You don't make your money on insurance unless you're an insurance company, right? You buy insurance in case something bad happens.
Right.
You don't want to get rich on your life insurance. If you got rich on your life insurance, that means you died, right?
That's correct.
So I think you need to think of inflation hedges that way.
That's great advice. Jerry Bowyer, thank you so much. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Again, Jerry Bowyer, thank you for your time and your expertise. I want to close out talking about your latest book. You've written a few, but your latest book is The Maker versus the Takers, What Jesus Said About Social Justice and Economics. Now, this is not a typical book about faith and economics. So I want to start by asking you what inspired you to write the book and what is the drive behind the book?
Well, I wasn't inspired to write the book. I was nagged into writing the book by a friend who's in the publishing industry. What inspired me to do the research was I really wanted to know what Jesus thought about economics. And I didn't want to fall into the trap that I've seen so many other people like me fall into, which is to take my best thinking and hang it on Jesus. Now, sometimes we take our best thinking and hang it on Jesus, and it's really pretty bad thinking. So a lot of socialism has been hung like little Velcro onto the gospel. And that's pretty bad thinking in my view. I think free market thinking is a much better quality of thought, but it's still not the job of somebody who's reading the Bible to take their free market philosophy and hang it on Jesus. So I wanted to let Jesus speak to me, or actually listen to him, which means reading the Gospels very carefully, looking at the original languages and looking at historical context and geographical context to let this come through. And I did it. My wife and I did this to some degree. We tend to do our research projects together. We unearthed so much that we had no idea was there. And I had been a Christian and an economist for 35 years before and really had studied a fair amount. But I'd never gone really that deep before. And then a friend who's in publishing called me and said, I want to do a book with you. What are you working on? And I named 3 sort of bins of research I'd been working on, and this was one of them. And he decided that that was the one that should be a book. And I didn't want to do a book because I love these ideas so much that it's kind of painful for an author if you take ideas that you love and you put them out there and people don't get them or they attack them without understanding them, because there's a lot of that, attack a book they haven't read. And I thought that'll be kind of heartbreaking for me. So better just to keep it. But eventually we did do the book, and the reviews on Amazon indicate that people actually have read it and really seem to like these ideas. They are receiving what I'm actually saying.
Oh, that's fantastic. Let me ask about the content of this book. You just said, it's whether it's socialism, Marxism that's trying to hang their economic view on Jesus, or it's free market. You don't like that approach of taking your worldview and hanging it on Jesus. Obviously, you've seen this occur in economics and politics in the church. What is your concern with that?
My concern is that Jesus is not ammunition. He's not an armory for our ideological battles. He's the Lord, and we fight his battles. And so we have to hear what our Lord says. Now, that doesn't mean you don't come to a conclusion. I was a free market economist before I started doing this research, and I'm free market after. I've modified some views, and I didn't want to. There were things that Jesus talked me into that I didn't want, that I had a certain resistance to. But now I feel like I've got a much better sense, not about what Jesus isn't saying. Like I hear this from friends all the time. Jesus says give to the poor, but he doesn't say use government. Well, okay, that's right, he doesn't. But I don't really care that much what he doesn't say. I care what he did say. And what we see is an overwhelming pattern in the Gospels. I can find no exceptions to it. When Jesus is in an entrepreneurial zone where you've got a growing economy, where there's a decentralization, a lot of small businesses, lower taxes, you don't have like a powerful super ruling class, he never confronts anybody over wealth, even though Jesus grew up around wealthy people. We now know that. Nazareth was very near to Sepphoris. Sepphoris had banks, Sepphoris had mansions. There were wealthy people within easy walking distance of Nazareth, but there are no records of Jesus confronting any of those people. It's only when he gets down to the center of government, Judea, and then Jerusalem within Judea, that he begins to have confrontations over wealth, and it's always with somebody tied to the power of the state. The rich young ruler, Zacchaeus the tax collector, and the money changers who have a government-granted monopoly at Herod's temple. So Jesus is actively confronting crony economics. Whether you want to call it crony capitalism or socialism or fascism, communism, nomenclature, whatever, doesn't really matter that much. When you centralize power in the state, there's always a group of people who cluster around that. They use their access to that power to extract wealth from other people. So that's why it's the maker versus the takers. Jesus is a maker, a builder. His father, his earthly father, was a builder. His heavenly father was a builder and maker of heaven and earth. And what we see is Jesus is never confronting creators of wealth. He's always confronting takers of wealth, extractors of wealth, all the time. That's the universal pattern.
A fascinating perspective. The book, again, is The Maker versus the Takers, what Jesus said about social justice and economics. Highly recommend it. Jerry Bowyer, thank you again for your time and your expertise. We hope you'll join us again on another episode.
It would be my pleasure. Great to be with you.
That is our show for tonight. I want to thank Jerry again for joining us, and thank you for tuning in. I hope you'll join us again right here next week. My name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.